at a party thrown to celebrate the sale of my own house. My son stood up in front of nearly 80 guests and told them his father had become a confused old man who could no longer be trusted to make his own decisions. I sat quietly in the corner, in the same plain clothes I've worn for 20 years, letting him finish every word. Then my attorney walked through that door with a folder that revealed I was worth more than everyone in that room combined, and that my son had spent the last 6 months trying to steal it. Before I tell you exactly how a quiet, modest old man let his family humiliate him in public, right up until the moment the truth finally came out, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe people show you exactly who they are, the moment they think you have nothing left to give them. My name is Henry Lawson. I am 71 years old, and for nearly 40 years I worked as a mechanical engineer, spending the majority of my career helping build a small engineering firm from 4 founding partners and a single rented office into a company that eventually became one of the most respected names in industrial and defense engineering in the entire country. I studied mechanical engineering at a state university, working my way through school with part-time jobs and a partial scholarship. Having grown up in a working-class family that valued practical skill over inherited advantage, a value system that shaped nearly every decision I've made throughout my adult life. I met my 3 eventual co-founders during my first job out of college, working at a mid-sized engineering firm, where we spent our lunch breaks discussing, half-jokingly at first, the kind of company we might build if we ever struck out on our own. That half-joking conversation eventually became serious enough that all 4 of us, in our late 20s, pooled our modest savings and rented a small office space, betting everything on our combined technical expertise, and a handful of promising early contracts we'd managed to secure through sheer persistence, and long hours nobody else was willing to put in. I remember those early years with a particular fondness. The 4 of us working 16-hour days in that cramped rented office, surviving on coffee, and the shared conviction that our combined technical skill genuinely exceeded what larger, more established firms were offering their clients. We landed our first significant contract, a modest industrial equipment design project for a regional manufacturer, roughly 8 months after opening our doors, and I remember all 4 of us celebrating that evening with nothing more than a cheap bottle of champagne and an overwhelming sense of possibility that felt, at the time, considerably more valuable than any specific financial milestone. We named the company Kestrel Dynamics after a small, fast falcon one of my co-founders had spotted during a hiking trip the weekend we finalized our incorporation paperwork. A name that felt, at the time, aspirational for a small company hoping to move quickly and precisely in an industry dominated by considerably larger, slower-moving competitors. I retired 18 years ago, stepping back from day-to-day operations, while quietly retaining the founding equity stake I'd earned as one of the original 4 partners who built that company from nothing back in the early years of my career. Most people in my small town, including, I believe, most of my own extended family, assume I retired with nothing more than a modest pension, living out my remaining years in the same unassuming 2-bedroom house I've called home for over 3 decades. That assumption has never once bothered me. In fact, I cultivated it deliberately. My wife Margaret Lawson passed away 9 years ago after a long illness, and in the years since, I've lived simply, driving the same reliable but unremarkable sedan I bought over a decade ago, wearing the same practical, inexpensive clothing I've always favored, spending my days tending a small vegetable garden and volunteering twice a week at the local library, helping children with their reading. Nothing about my daily life would suggest, to any casual observer, that I hold a founding equity stake in a company now valued, following a series of major defense and energy contracts secured over the past several years, at several $billion. I should clarify, given the coincidence of names, that my late wife Margaret and my longtime attorney Margaret Ellis share only a first name, an overlap that occasionally confused acquaintances over the years, but never once caused genuine difficulty in my own life, given how clearly I've always distinguished the 2 women, one my partner of 43 years, the other my trusted legal counsel of over 2 decades. My wife Margaret and I raised Derek together in that same modest house, and her steady, warm presence throughout his childhood always struck me as the primary source of whatever emotional grounding he possessed as a young man, grounding that seemed, in the years following her death, to gradually erode as Derek navigated adulthood increasingly without her guidance. I remember, In the early months after Margaret's passing, Derek visiting more frequently than he had in years, both of us finding a strange, quiet comfort in shared grief that briefly brought us closer than we'd been since his own childhood. That closeness, unfortunately, proved short-lived, gradually giving way, over the following years, to the increasingly transactional dynamic that would eventually culminate in everything I'm describing in this story. I have wondered, more than once since everything unfolded, whether Margaret's absence removed some crucial buffer that had once moderated Derek's worst impulses, or whether the changes in our relationship would have occurred regardless of her presence, driven by financial pressures that had little to do with grief and everything to do with Derek's own increasingly desperate circumstances. I made the decision, decades ago, to keep my actual financial standing almost entirely private, sharing it with no one beyond my late wife, my attorney, and a small handful of financial advisors bound by confidentiality. I did not make this choice out of any particular paranoia or distrust of the world generally. I made it because I had watched, over the course of my career, more than one wealthy colleague discover, often too late and too painfully, that sudden visible wealth has a way of fundamentally altering how people, even people who claim to love you, choose to treat you. I wanted, more than almost anything else in my life, to know that the people around me valued my actual presence, my actual character, rather than whatever they believed they might eventually inherit or extract from me. I did not anticipate, when I made that decision decades ago, that it would eventually reveal something so genuinely painful about my own son. My son Derek is 45 years old, married to a woman named Vanessa for the past 12 years, and together they've built a lifestyle in a nearby city that has always struck me as considerably more extravagant than their actual, visible income could reasonably support. Derek works in commercial real estate development, and Vanessa runs a boutique event planning business that, from what little I've gathered over the years, generates considerably more expenses than actual profit. They live in a large home in an upscale neighborhood, drive expensive vehicles, and maintain a social calendar filled with the kind of visible, curated luxury that always seemed, even before everything that eventually unfolded, somewhat disconnected from any obvious source of sustainable income. I remember visiting their home for a holiday gathering roughly 2 years before everything came to a head, noting, with a quiet concern I never fully voiced at the time, the renovated kitchen, the new luxury vehicles parked in their driveway, Vanessa's increasingly elaborate wardrobe, all of it accumulating at a pace that seemed considerably faster than Derek's actual reported income from his real estate development ventures could reasonably explain. I mentioned this concern to Margaret Ellis once, in passing, during an unrelated conversation about my own financial planning, and she noted, gently, that it wasn't uncommon for people building visible success to also be quietly accumulating significant private debt, a comment that would prove considerably more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. Derek and Vanessa's 2 children, my only grandchildren, Emma and Nathan, now teenagers, had grown noticeably more distant from me over the preceding several years as well. Visits growing shorter and less frequent, phone calls increasingly brief and perfunctory. I've often wondered how much of that distance reflected genuine teenage disinterest in spending time with a grandfather living a considerably quieter, less exciting lifestyle than their own increasingly affluent-seeming household, and how much reflected Derek and Vanessa's own gradually cultivated narrative about my supposed limitations, a narrative I would only fully understand the scope of much later. Derek and Vanessa's visits to my modest home grew steadily less frequent over the years following Margaret's death, and when they did visit, our conversations increasingly circled back, in ways that felt uncomfortably transactional, even before I fully understood why, to questions about my finances, my health, my long-term living arrangements. I remember Derek mentioning, roughly a year before everything came to a head, that my house, sitting on a reasonably large lot in a neighborhood that had appreciated considerably since I first purchased it decades earlier, represented wasted potential for a man living alone, suggesting, not for the first time, that I might consider selling and moving into something smaller, freeing up capital he described, somewhat vaguely, as being better utilized elsewhere. I declined, as I had declined similar suggestions on previous occasions, telling Derek simply that I was comfortable in my home and had no interest in relocating. What I did not fully understand, at the time, was exactly how much financial pressure was actually building behind Derek's increasingly insistent suggestions, pressure that would eventually explain nearly everything that followed over the subsequent months. The rumors began, as far as I can trace them, roughly 8 months before everything came to a head. My niece Patricia called me one afternoon, her voice carrying an odd, careful concern, asking whether I was doing all right, whether I'd been feeling forgetful lately, whether I'd noticed any changes in my memory. I told her, genuinely confused by the question, that I felt entirely fine, that nothing had changed about my daily functioning. She seemed hesitant to elaborate further, though she mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had expressed some concern to the extended family about changes he'd apparently noticed during recent visits. Missed details in conversation, occasional confusion about dates or names. I later learned, through a conversation with my longtime neighbor Ellen, who happened to attend the same church as several of my extended family members, that Derek had been sharing considerably more specific and troubling anecdotes than the vague concerns Patricia had initially described to me. Ellen mentioned, somewhat awkwardly, that she'd heard secondhand about an incident where I had supposedly left my stove on unattended for hours, nearly starting a fire, an incident that had never actually occurred, and that I confirmed, checking with Ellen directly, bore no resemblance to any actual event in my recent life. Another fabricated anecdote, which reached me through my sister roughly a month later, described me supposedly getting lost driving to a location I'd visited hundreds of times over the preceding decade, wandering for hours before eventually finding my way home. Another incident that simply never happened. I want to be clear that nothing Patricia described bore any resemblance to my actual mental state. I have never experienced any genuine cognitive decline, a fact my longtime physician has confirmed repeatedly through regular checkups over the years, including a comprehensive cognitive assessment I underwent, at Margaret's suggestion, specifically, to have current, documented evidence available should Derek's fabricated narrative ever require formal, medical rebuttal. But I began to understand, over the following weeks, that Derek had apparently been quietly cultivating exactly this narrative among our extended family, mentioning small, fabricated, or wildly exaggerated anecdotes to cousins, to my sister, to old family friends, planting seeds of doubt about my cognitive stability that, once planted, seemed to spread and compound on their own momentum, regardless of how demonstrably untrue they actually were. I noticed the effects of this campaign gradually, extended family members treating me with a careful, patronizing gentleness during holiday gatherings that felt, increasingly, less like genuine concern and more like people had already privately concluded something was fundamentally wrong with me. My sister mentioned, during one particularly uncomfortable phone call, that Derek had suggested it might be time for me to consider additional support. Language vague enough to avoid direct confrontation, but specific enough that I understood exactly what kind of arrangement Derek was quietly building consensus toward, among people whose good opinion I'd spent decades cultivating honestly. The moment everything crystallized for me came roughly 5 months before that final party, when I received a call from my bank's local branch manager, a woman named Susan who I'd known for nearly 15 years, through my modest, ordinary checking account, informing me that someone claiming to hold power of attorney on my behalf had attempted to inquire about accessing my accounts. I told Susan, with genuine confusion, that I had never granted power of attorney to anyone, that no such document existed. Susan, to her considerable credit, had already recognized the request as irregular and had declined to provide any information, but she wanted to confirm directly with me before escalating the matter formally. I remember the particular disorientation of that phone call, standing in my kitchen holding the phone, trying to process the idea that someone had walked into my bank, a place I'd visited regularly for over 15 years, and attempted to claim legal authority over accounts I had personally managed my entire adult life, without incident or concern. Susan's voice carried genuine concern throughout that call, and I remember her mentioning, almost apologetically, that she'd worked with elderly clients before, who had experienced exactly this kind of attempted exploitation, and that she wanted to make absolutely certain I understood the seriousness of what had just been attempted, before I decided how to proceed. Susan followed up with me again roughly a week later, mentioning that the bank's internal fraud prevention team had flagged the incident formally, and that she personally recommended I file a report with local law enforcement, given the clear evidence of attempted document fraud. I thanked her for her diligence, and told her that Margaret and I were already handling the matter through appropriate legal channels, though I remained deliberately vague about the specific scope of our investigation, understanding, even at that early stage, that discretion would ultimately serve our purposes far better than premature public disclosure. I drove to the bank that same afternoon and reviewed, with Susan's careful assistance, the documentation the individual had presented, a power of attorney document bearing what appeared to be my signature, notarized by someone I had never met, at an office I had never visited. The signature, upon close examination, was a reasonably competent forgery, close enough to fool a casual glance, but noticeably different, in several specific details, the pressure and flow of certain letters, from my actual, genuine signature, which I had used consistently, without significant variation, for over 4 decades. I asked Susan who had presented the document, and though she was initially hesitant given privacy considerations, she eventually confirmed, once I explained the clearly fraudulent nature of what had been attempted, that the individual had identified himself as my son, Derek Lawson. I sat in my car in that bank parking lot for a long time after that conversation, processing the particular, specific pain of understanding that my own son had apparently forged legal documents in an attempt to gain unauthorized control over my finances, built on a foundation of fabricated rumors about my mental competency that he had spent months quietly cultivating among people who trusted his account of things, over any direct experience of their own with me. I called Margaret Ellis that same evening. Margaret had served as legal counsel for my engineering firm for over 20 years during my active career, and had continued handling my personal legal affairs following my retirement, a relationship built on decades of trust and discretion that made her the obvious first call once I understood the scope of what I was actually facing. I first met Margaret shortly after Kestrel Dynamics secured its first major government contract, when the company needed considerably more sophisticated legal counsel than the small local attorney who had handled our initial incorporation paperwork. Margaret had impressed all 4 founding partners immediately, with her thoroughness and her willingness to identify potential problems before they materialized, rather than simply responding to crises after the fact, qualities that had made her an essential part of the company's leadership for the following 2 decades. Margaret listened to my account of the forged power of attorney, the dementia rumors, the pattern of increasingly pointed comments about selling my house, and I remember her voice growing progressively more serious as I laid out each piece of the picture. "Henry," she said once I'd finished, "I want you to understand that what you're describing isn't simply a family disagreement. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at attempted elder financial fraud, forgery, and quite possibly a coordinated campaign specifically designed to establish false grounds for guardianship. This needs to be handled carefully and thoroughly." I remember sitting in my kitchen during that call, looking out at my own small garden through the window, the same garden I still tended every morning as a kind of meditative ritual, feeling the particular disorientation of understanding that my own son had apparently spent months constructing an elaborate scheme against me, while I continued living my quiet, ordinary daily life, completely unaware of the extent of what was actually happening around me. Margaret and I met at her office 2 days later, and together we began the careful process of documenting exactly what Derek had been attempting, and understanding, more fully, exactly why. Margaret retained a forensic document examiner who confirmed definitively that the signature on the power of attorney document was a forgery, and traced the notarization to a small, obscure notary office that, upon further investigation, appeared to have processed several other documents connected to what the examiner described as a pattern consistent with elder financial exploitation cases she'd encountered in previous work. More troubling still, Margaret's investigation into Derek's own financial circumstances, conducted through legitimate public records and financial disclosure requirements connected to several of his real estate development ventures, revealed a picture considerably more desperate than I had ever suspected. Derek's commercial real estate development company had suffered significant losses over the preceding 2 years. Several major projects collapsing under the weight of rising interest rates and construction cost overruns that Derek had apparently financed through increasingly aggressive personal borrowing, guarantees, and, in at least 2 instances Margaret's investigation uncovered, funds diverted from investor accounts in ways that bordered on, if not crossed entirely into, outright securities fraud. Margaret retained a forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Rachel Kim, who had worked previously with the district attorney's office on several complex financial crimes cases, to conduct a thorough review of Derek's business filings, court records connected to 2 pending civil lawsuits from disgruntled investors, and public liens filed against several of his properties. Rachel's findings, presented to Margaret and me during a lengthy meeting roughly 6 weeks into our investigation, painted a portrait of a man drowning in debt considerably more severe than either of us had initially imagined. Outstanding obligations exceeding $4 million across various failed development projects, personal guarantees he'd made to lenders who were now aggressively pursuing collection, and at least one instance of what Rachel described as commingling, investor funds intended for one specific project, apparently redirected to cover shortfalls on an entirely different, unrelated venture, a pattern that, once documented, carried serious legal exposure well beyond simple business failure. Margaret explained the picture to me plainly during our second meeting. "Henry, your son is drowning financially, and based on everything I'm seeing here, he's been drowning for well over a year. Selling your house wouldn't have solved his actual problem, not at the scale of debt we're looking at, but it would have bought him time, and more importantly, established a precedent of control over your finances that he could have then leveraged much more significantly once he had legal guardianship established through a fabricated competency claim." I want to take a moment here to explain something about my own financial history that becomes essential to understanding everything that followed. 40 years ago, alongside 3 colleagues, I helped found a mechanical and industrial engineering firm called Kestrel Dynamics, starting with nothing more than a small rented office and a handful of promising defense and industrial contracts we'd managed to secure through sheer persistence and technical competence. I served as the company's chief mechanical engineer for over 3 decades, retiring 18 years ago but retaining, as one of the 4 founding partners, a significant equity stake in the company that I had simply never sold, choosing instead to let it remain invested as the company continued growing under new leadership long after my own active involvement ended. Over the years since my retirement, Kestrel Dynamics had grown substantially, securing several major long-term defense contracts and, more recently, expanding aggressively into renewable energy infrastructure projects that had positioned the company at the center of several multi-billion-dollar government and private sector initiatives. I followed the company's growth from a comfortable distance over the years, occasionally receiving updates from former colleagues who remained active in leadership, watching with quiet pride as the small firm I'd helped build from a single rented office eventually secured contracts, supplying critical components for national defense systems, and later, as energy demands shifted, major infrastructure projects supporting the renewable energy transition that had become increasingly central to the country's long-term strategic priorities. I remember reading, roughly 3 years before everything with Derek unfolded, a business publication's profile of Kestrel Dynamics' remarkable growth trajectory, mentioning the company's original 4 founders only briefly, in a single sentence near the article's conclusion, my own name appearing in print, in a way that felt, reading it in my quiet kitchen, strangely disconnected from the modest, unremarkable life I actually lived day to day. I remember feeling, reading that article, a particular satisfaction, knowing that the value my equity stake represented remained entirely private, entirely separate from how the world, including my own family, perceived me on a daily basis. My founding equity stake, which I had quietly maintained, and occasionally, through my financial advisors, modestly diversified over the decades, had grown, by the time of everything I'm describing in this story, to a value exceeding $3 billion, a figure that would have seemed almost fantastical to me during those early years working out of a small rented office with 3 ambitious colleagues, and a figure that not a single member of my extended family, including my own son, had any awareness of whatsoever. I had made the deliberate choice decades earlier to keep this wealth almost entirely private, maintaining the same modest lifestyle I'd always preferred, living in the same house, driving unremarkable vehicles, wearing simple clothing, precisely because I wanted, more than almost anything, to understand who in my life valued me for who I actually was, rather than what they might eventually stand to gain from me. Margaret was one of perhaps 4 people alive who fully understood the actual scope of my financial standing, and as she laid out, during that second meeting, exactly what Derek appeared to be attempting, I understood, with a clarity that felt both painful and strangely clarifying, that I was finally about to discover the answer to a question I had quietly wondered about for decades. I made the decision, working closely with Margaret over the following weeks, not to confront Derek directly with what we had uncovered. Margaret explained, drawing on her decades of legal experience, that confronting him prematurely risked either provoking him into destroying evidence or accelerating whatever scheme he was building toward before we had a complete, legally airtight picture of everything he had attempted. "Henry," she told me, "the strongest position we can build is one where Derek believes he's still operating successfully, right up until the moment the entire picture becomes public and undeniable. Patience protects you far better than confrontation would right now." I did not have to wait long to see exactly how far Derek intended to take his campaign. Over the following 2 months, having apparently grown frustrated by the slow progress of his attempted power of attorney scheme, Derek began pursuing what I can only describe as a more aggressive public strategy, spreading increasingly specific and damaging claims about my supposed cognitive decline, among not just extended family, but community members, my longtime neighbors even. I eventually learned a local real estate agent, Derek, had quietly begun consulting about listing my house for sale, presenting himself as acting on my behalf despite having no legitimate authority whatsoever to do so. I received a call one afternoon from that real estate agent, a young woman named Kimberly who, to her considerable credit, called me directly before proceeding any further, mentioning that Derek had approached her about listing my property and describing me as no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Kimberly explained that Derek had presented himself confidently, showing her what he described as documentation supporting his authority to act on my behalf. Documentation, Margaret would later confirm, consisted of the same forged power of attorney the bank had already rejected months earlier, apparently still being circulated by Derek despite its clear illegitimacy. I told her, calmly, that I had no intention of selling my home and had never authorized Derek to pursue any such arrangement on my behalf. Kimberly, clearly uncomfortable with what she now recognized as an irregular situation, thanked me for clarifying, and told me she would not proceed with anything Derek had requested, though she mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, that Derek had seemed quite confident throughout their conversation that the sale would proceed within the coming months, regardless of any resistance I might initially show. "He mentioned something about a guardianship process, Mr. Lawson," Kimberly told me, her voice carrying genuine concern. "He made it sound like it was already essentially settled, like your objection wouldn't actually matter much longer. I have to be honest, the whole conversation left me feeling pretty uneasy, which is part of why I wanted to reach out to you directly, rather than just proceeding based on what he told me." I thanked Kimberly sincerely for her diligence, understanding that her willingness to verify directly with me, rather than simply accepting Derek's confident presentation of forged documentation, had likely prevented a considerably more public and complicated situation from developing before Margaret and I had fully prepared our response. Derek's confidence, I would come to understand, stemmed from a specific and troubling detail Margaret uncovered during this same period. Evidence that Derek had already begun quietly researching guardianship proceedings through an attorney of his own, apparently preparing to formally petition the court for legal authority over my affairs, based on the fabricated competency narrative he'd spent months building among people inclined to trust his account of things. It was roughly 3 weeks after learning of Derek's guardianship research that I received, through my sister, rather than directly from Derek himself, an invitation to what was described as a celebration Derek and Vanessa were hosting at their home, ostensibly to mark what the invitation vaguely described as a new chapter for the family. I understood, almost immediately upon reading it, exactly what this celebration was actually intended to mark. Derek had apparently proceeded, in his own mind, confident enough in the eventual success of his guardianship petition and my house sale, to treat the matter as effectively settled, planning a gathering to formalize, socially, if not yet fully legally, his assumption of control over my affairs and my property. Margaret and I discussed at length whether I should attend this gathering at all, weighing the emotional difficulty of walking into what would clearly be an uncomfortable, possibly humiliating situation, against the strategic value of allowing Derek to fully reveal, in front of witnesses, exactly how far he intended to take his campaign before the truth came out. Ultimately, I decided to attend, choosing to wear the same simple, unremarkable clothing I always favored. understanding that Derek's entire narrative depended on people continuing to see me as the diminished, confused old man he had spent months constructing in their minds, and that arriving exactly as that expected version of myself would only make the eventual revelation land with greater force once the truth finally emerged. We spent the days leading up to the party, finalizing every detail of our plan with careful precision. Margaret coordinated directly with Detective Sergeant Wilkins from the county's Financial Crimes Division, who had been overseeing the referred investigation into Derek's securities fraud and forgery for several weeks by that point, ensuring that officers would be positioned nearby and ready to move the moment Margaret's presentation concluded. Margaret and I rehearsed her presentation twice at her office, timing it carefully, deciding exactly which pieces of evidence to present in which order, for maximum clarity and impact, understanding that this needed to unfold as a clear, undeniable revelation rather than a confusing jumble of complicated financial and legal details that might lose the assembled audience's attention or understanding. I remember the particular quality of nervousness I felt the morning of the party, understanding that I was about to walk into a room full of people who had spent months being told I was a confused, diminished old man, understanding that maintaining that appearance for one final evening required a discipline I wasn't entirely certain I possessed, given how deeply Derek's public humiliation of me was likely to cut, regardless of how carefully I'd prepared myself for it emotionally. The party took place on a warm Saturday evening at Derek and Vanessa's large home. Nearly 80 guests gathered across their expansive backyard and interior living spaces, string lights hung throughout, catering staff circulating with trays of expensive appetizers, the entire event carrying the particular polish of a celebration Derek clearly intended to be remembered. I arrived deliberately a few minutes after the gathering had already begun, wanting to observe the room's dynamics before drawing any attention to my own presence. I recognized many of the assembled guests as I made my way slowly through the crowd. Extended family members I'd known for decades. Several of Derek's business associates I'd met only briefly over the years. Neighbors from Derek and Vanessa's affluent community, whose familiarity with our family situation was clearly filtered entirely through whatever version of events Derek had chosen to share with them. I noticed my grandchildren, Emma and Nathan, standing near the pool with a small group of teenagers, and I remember the particular ache of watching them glance in my direction with an expression that carried more caution than warmth, clearly having absorbed, over recent months, whatever narrative their parents had constructed about my supposed condition. I found a quiet corner near the edge of the backyard, greeting the handful of relatives who approached me with the same careful, patronizing gentleness I had grown accustomed to over the preceding months, several of them speaking to me in the particular slow, simplified tone people reserve for someone they've been led to believe struggles to follow ordinary conversation. My sister approached at one point, squeezing my hand with a gentle, sorrowful expression, telling me quietly that she was glad I'd decided to come, that she hoped I understood everyone here genuinely loved me and simply wanted what was best for me. Words that, understanding everything I now knew about the actual situation, struck me as almost unbearably sad in their sincere, misguided compassion. I absorbed each of these small indignities without protest, understanding that every moment of Derek's constructed narrative playing out in front of me only strengthened the eventual impact of what Margaret and I had prepared. I checked my watch periodically, tracking the time against the schedule Margaret and I had carefully coordinated, understanding that she would be arriving precisely 45 minutes into the gathering, timed specifically to allow Derek's speech, whatever form it took, to fully unfold before her intervention. Roughly 40 minutes into the gathering, Derek climbed onto a small raised platform near the pool, tapping a glass to draw the crowd's attention, and began a speech that I understood, from his opening words, was going to be considerably more pointed than a simple celebratory toast. He spoke first about family, about the difficult decisions that sometimes come with caring for aging parents, his voice carrying the practiced, sympathetic cadence of someone who had clearly rehearsed this particular framing. Family means making hard choices sometimes, Derek told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily across the quieted backyard. It means recognizing when someone you love needs more support than they're able to ask for themselves. My father built a good, honest life, and I'll always respect the man he was. But watching him struggle these past couple of years, watching him forget things, get confused, sometimes not even recognize how much he actually needs help. That's been one of the hardest things I've ever had to accept." He paused, his voice catching with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and I watched several guests around me dab at their own eyes in sympathy. And then, gesturing toward where I stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, he began describing me directly, telling nearly 80 assembled guests that his father had, over recent years, become increasingly confused, increasingly unable to manage his own affairs safely, and that the family had made the difficult but necessary decision to help transition me into a living arrangement better suited to my current needs. A decision he framed, with a performance of visible emotional difficulty, as one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do out of love for me. He mentioned, specifically, that the sale of my house had already been arranged, describing it as finally settled, after what he characterized as months of gentle, patient effort to help me understand it was the right decision. A claim that bore no resemblance whatsoever to any conversation I had actually had with him. I stood in that backyard, in my plain, unremarkable clothing, listening to my own son describe me, in front of nearly 80 people, as a diminished, confused old man, requiring intervention and oversight, watching heads nod sympathetically throughout the crowd, watching people I had known for years exchange glances that carried genuine, if entirely misplaced, pity. Vanessa stood beside Derek throughout this entire speech, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, performing a grief that struck me, watching it unfold, as considerably more theatrical than genuine. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice or object. I simply stood quietly, absorbing every word, understanding that Margaret would be arriving within the hour, and that everything Derek was constructing so carefully in front of this audience was about to collapse entirely. Margaret arrived precisely as we had planned, walking through the side gate into that backyard carrying a leather folder, dressed in the same sharp, professional attire she'd worn to countless important meetings throughout her career. And I watched Derek's face shift, in real time, from the practiced sympathy of his speech into genuine confusion, as he recognized her, having met Margaret briefly on a handful of occasions over the years, without ever fully understanding the actual scope of her role in my life. "Derek," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quieting backyard. "I apologize for interrupting your event, but given what you've just told all these people about your father, I think it's important that everyone here also hears the complete and accurate picture." She walked toward the small platform where Derek still stood, guests parting to let her pass, an unmistakable authority in her bearing that immediately signaled to the assembled crowd that whatever was about to happen carried considerably more weight than an ordinary family disagreement. She opened her leather folder and began, methodically and without any dramatic flourish, presenting the actual facts of my situation to the assembled crowd. She explained my role as a founding partner of Kestrel Dynamics, the current value of my equity stake, the complete absence of any medical documentation supporting the cognitive decline Derek had been describing for months, contrasted directly against recent evaluation records from my own physician, confirming my full, unimpaired mental competency. She held up, for the assembled crowd to see, a printed copy of my most recent cognitive assessment, dated only 3 weeks earlier, confirming in clear medical language that I showed no signs whatsoever of the decline Derek had spent months describing to family and friends. I watched the crowd's expression shift, guest by guest, from sympathetic pity directed at me, toward a dawning, uncomfortable understanding of exactly what they were actually witnessing. Several guests pulled out their phones, though not, this time, to capture footage of a confused old man being lovingly transitioned into care, but rather the unfolding revelation of a son who had apparently spent months fabricating a story for reasons that were about to become considerably clearer. My sister stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, her hand still pressed to her mouth from the earlier moment of sympathy she'd shown me, now visibly processing the realization that the compassion she'd extended toward Derek's narrative had been built entirely on fabrication. I found my eyes drawn, during this unfolding revelation, to my grandchildren standing near the pool, watching Emma's face in particular shift from the cautious wariness she'd shown me earlier in the evening into something closer to confused, dawning horror as she began to understand that everything her father had apparently told her about my supposed condition over recent months had been entirely untrue. Nathan, only 15, looked considerably more lost, glancing back and forth between his father and Margaret, with the particular bewilderment of a teenager suddenly realizing the adults he trusted most had been fundamentally dishonest with him about something significant. I felt, watching their faces in that moment, a complicated mixture of relief that the truth was finally emerging and genuine grief for what this revelation was about to cost them. Two children, about to learn something devastating about their own father, in front of nearly 80 witnesses. Margaret continued, her voice remaining calm and procedural even as the content of what she was sharing grew increasingly damning. She described the forged power of attorney document, confirmed through forensic handwriting analysis, as fraudulent. She described Derek's escalating financial distress, the failed real estate ventures, the diverted investor funds that, she noted, had already been formally referred to the appropriate financial crimes authorities weeks earlier, once the pattern became sufficiently clear and documented. Derek stood frozen on that raised platform beside the pool, his earlier practiced sympathy completely evaporated, replaced by a kind of stunned, cornered panic as he watched his carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time in front of the exact audience he had assembled specifically to witness his version of events. Vanessa's theatrical tears had stopped entirely, her expression shifting into something closer to genuine alarm as she began to understand the scope of what was actually unfolding. Margaret's presentation, continuing methodically despite the growing murmur of shocked conversation rippling through the crowd, included documentation Rachel Kim had uncovered, suggesting that Vanessa had been considerably more aware of Derek's scheme than either of them had likely anticipated becoming public. Several text message exchanges, obtained through the formal financial crimes investigation once Derek's activities came under official scrutiny, showed Vanessa actively participating in conversations about the planned house sale, discussing specific renovation plans for what she referred to in one message as Henry's old place, as though the sale had already been finalized months before any legitimate authority to proceed actually existed. I watched Vanessa's face as Margaret read a brief excerpt of one particularly damning message aloud, watched her attempt, unsuccessfully, to maintain the composed, sympathetic expression she'd worn throughout Derek's earlier speech. I remember thinking in that moment about how thoroughly both Derek and Vanessa had apparently convinced themselves that their scheme carried no real risk, that an elderly widower living quietly in a modest house represented an easy, uncomplicated target, rather than a man who had spent 4 decades building precisely the kind of careful, patient discipline that had allowed him to recognize and methodically dismantle exactly this sort of exploitation attempt. As Margaret finished her presentation, exactly as we had coordinated in advance, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into the driveway, and detectives from the county's Financial Crimes Division, along with a uniformed officer, walked through the same side gate Margaret had entered through minutes earlier. The lead detective approached Derek directly, informing him, in front of the entire stunned gathering, that he was being taken into custody in connection with securities fraud, attempted elder financial exploitation, and forgery, formally reading him his rights, while nearly 80 guests, many of whom had arrived that evening, prepared to celebrate what they believed was a loving family transition, watched in complete, horrified silence. I did not gloat. I have never found satisfaction in another person's downfall, even my own son's, even after everything he had attempted against me over the preceding months. I simply stood in that backyard, watching detectives lead Derek toward the waiting vehicle, understanding that whatever came next for our relationship would require considerably more than a single dramatic evening to work through, if it could be worked through at all. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision I had actually been quietly contemplating for years, long before Derek's scheme ever forced my hand. I announced, working through Margaret and a small team of financial advisors, the establishment of a scholarship foundation that would direct the significant majority of my estate toward funding technical and vocational education for low-income students pursuing careers in engineering and skilled trades. The same kind of practical, hands-on education that had allowed a young man with no family wealth of his own to eventually help build a company now worth billions. I named it simply the Lawson Technical Scholarship Fund, wanting it to carry forward not my personal wealth, but the actual values that had allowed me to build that wealth in the first place: patience, technical competence, and a genuine belief that opportunity should be earned through capability rather than inherited through circumstance. I worked closely with Margaret and a small advisory board over the following months to structure the foundation's specific programs, ultimately settling on a model that would provide full scholarships to community college and technical program students pursuing mechanical, electrical, and industrial engineering credentials, along with a mentorship component connecting recipients directly with practicing engineers, several of them former colleagues from my own career at Kestrel Dynamics, who eagerly volunteered their time once they understood the foundation's purpose. I insisted, during the planning process, that the foundation prioritize students from working-class backgrounds specifically, remembering acutely my own early struggles funding my education through part-time jobs and a modest scholarship, wanting to ensure that talented young people facing similar circumstances would never have to choose between pursuing their technical ambitions and managing basic financial survival, the way I once had to carefully balance both. The foundation awarded its first 12 scholarships within the initial year of operation, and I made a point of personally attending the small ceremony where those first recipients were announced, meeting each of them individually, listening to their own stories and ambitions with a genuine interest that had nothing to do with any transaction or expectation, simply the quiet satisfaction of watching opportunity extend itself toward people who had earned it, through demonstrated effort and capability, rather than inherited privilege. Derek called me from jail roughly 2 weeks after his arrest, out on bail while awaiting formal charges, his voice carrying a rawness I hadn't heard from him in years, apologizing repeatedly, crying through most of the call, telling me he'd made terrible decisions, born out of desperation and pride, admitting, for the first time in months, the actual scope of the financial pressure that had driven him toward everything he'd attempted against me. He described through halting, difficult admissions, exactly how deep his debts had grown, how the initial small compromises, a slightly stretched invoice here, a delayed disclosure there, had gradually compounded into something he no longer felt any control over, until fabricating a story about my cognitive decline had begun to feel, in his own distorted reasoning during that desperate period, like a solvable problem rather than the serious crime it actually represented. I listened to my son's apology carefully, understanding that whatever genuine remorse he felt in that moment existed alongside months of calculated, deliberate deception that had caused real, lasting harm, both to me directly and to the investors whose funds he had diverted without their knowledge or consent. When he finished, I told him something I believe with my whole heart, something that has guided how I've approached every conversation with him since. Derek, forgiveness is possible. I love you, and I want, more than almost anything, to eventually rebuild something real between us. But trust is different from forgiveness. Trust has to be rebuilt, slowly, through consistent action over time, not through a single tearful phone call, however genuine it might feel to you right now. I have spoken with Derek periodically in the months since that call, brief, careful conversations that carry none of the easy familiarity our relationship once held, but that I've noticed, gradually, beginning to carry something closer to genuine honesty than our interactions had held for years before everything unraveled. He has completed his mandated financial counseling, and according to Emma, has taken a considerably more modest job managing property maintenance for a local real estate firm, a significant step down from his previous ambitions, but one that he apparently discusses, when Emma mentions it to me, with a kind of quiet acceptance rather than the resentment I might have expected. In the months since that party, I have watched Derek begin, slowly and imperfectly, the long process of rebuilding both his own life and whatever remains possible of our relationship. He pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation into his business dealings, avoiding the most severe potential sentence in exchange for restitution and several years of probation, along with mandatory financial counseling that he has, according to the little contact we've maintained, actually engaged with seriously. The formal guardianship petition Derek had begun preparing was, of course, immediately abandoned once the fraud was exposed, and the district attorney's office pursued charges specifically related to the forged power of attorney and the diverted investor funds, ultimately resulting in a sentence that included 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory restitution payments to the affected investors, and a formal admission of guilt entered into the public court record. Vanessa left him within 2 months of his arrest, unwilling, it seems, to weather the consequences of a scheme she had apparently known more about than she ever admitted to me directly. The divorce proceedings, from what I've gathered secondhand through Emma and Nathan, who I've made a deliberate, careful effort to remain close with throughout this entire ordeal, were considerably contentious. Vanessa apparently attempting to distance herself entirely from any knowledge of Derek's scheme, despite the text messages Margaret's investigation had already documented. I have made a point, in the time since, of maintaining regular, gentle contact with both grandchildren, wanting them to understand clearly that whatever happened between their father and me, my love for them remains entirely unaffected and unconditional. Emma, in particular, has grown considerably closer to me in the months since that party, calling regularly, visiting on weekends when her school schedule allows, asking increasingly thoughtful questions about my career, about the company I helped build, about the scholarship foundation and its purpose. I remember one particular conversation, sitting together on my modest back porch on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when she asked me, with a directness that reminded me powerfully of my late wife, why I had chosen to hide my actual wealth for so many years, rather than simply living the more comfortable, visible lifestyle my resources could easily have supported. I told her the truth, that I had wanted, more than almost anything, to know that the people in my life valued my actual presence and character, rather than what they might eventually gain from me, and that watching her father's scheme unfold, however painful, had ultimately confirmed exactly why that caution had always mattered so deeply to me. Nathan has taken somewhat longer to process everything that happened, understandably struggling with a more complicated mixture of anger toward his father and confusion about his own place within a family situation that had shifted so dramatically and publicly. I have been patient with him, understanding that a 15-year-old processing his father's public exposure and eventual conviction needs considerably more time and space than his older sister to work through those complicated emotions, and I have simply tried, in every interaction we've had since, to make clear that my door, and my genuine interest in his life, remains open without any conditions attached. I still live in the same modest house I've called home for over 3 decades, tending the same small garden, volunteering at the same local library twice a week, my daily life almost entirely unchanged by the revelation of my actual financial standing. The scholarship fund has already begun awarding its first grants, and I find genuine satisfaction watching young people, many of them from backgrounds not unlike my own modest beginnings, receive the kind of practical education that once allowed me to build something meaningful from nothing. I remember, vividly, the particular satisfaction of my volunteer work at the local library throughout this entire difficult period. Work that had nothing whatsoever to do with my actual financial resources, and everything to do with simple, direct human connection. I remember one particular afternoon, roughly a month after the party, sitting with a young girl named Sophia, who was struggling with a particularly difficult passage, feeling a genuine, uncomplicated joy, watching her face light up when she finally worked through the sentence successfully. A small moment of connection that reminded me powerfully of exactly why I had chosen, decades earlier, to live my actual daily life, so far removed from the visible trappings my wealth could easily have afforded. That volunteer work, more than almost anything else, helped me process the difficult months surrounding Derek's scheme and its eventual exposure, providing a steady, grounding routine that had nothing to do with billions of dollars or forged documents or courtroom proceedings. Simply the quiet, meaningful work of helping a child learn to read, work I intend to continue for as long as my health allows. I think often about the particular irony of everything that unfolded, that Derek spent months constructing an elaborate scheme to seize control of what he believed was a modest, unremarkable estate, never once suspecting that his own father, living so visibly simply, actually possessed resources that dwarfed anything he could have imagined extracting through fraud and deception. I think about how differently things might have unfolded if Derek had simply come to me honestly, months earlier, and admitted the genuine financial distress he was facing. I would have helped him, gladly, the same way any father would want to help a struggling child, not by handing over unlimited resources without accountability, but through honest conversation, practical support, and the kind of guidance that comes from someone who genuinely wants to see you succeed, rather than someone attempting to control or diminish you. I think often about the particular lesson this entire ordeal taught me, One I suspect applies far beyond my own unusual circumstances. People rarely show you who they truly are when they believe you have something valuable to offer them. They show you who they truly are in the moments when they believe you have nothing left to give, when they think no one is watching closely enough to notice how they actually choose to treat you. That, more than any number in any bank account, more than any equity stake in any company, is the truest measure of character I've encountered across 71 years of life. And it's the lesson I hope resonates with anyone watching this story, who has ever wondered whether the people around them value their presence, or simply what they believe that presence might eventually provide. I sit on my porch most evenings now, much as I always have, watching the sun set over my quiet, unremarkable street, and I think about Margaret, my late wife, wondering what she would have made of everything that unfolded, wondering whether she would have seen the warning signs earlier than I did, wondering whether her steady presence might have prevented Derek's slow drift toward the desperate choices that eventually led him to attempt something so genuinely damaging against his own father. I don't have clear answers to those questions, and I've stopped searching for them as urgently as I once did. What I have instead is a quiet, hard-won peace, the understanding that I protected myself, and eventually helped protect my son from himself as well, through patience rather than anger, through careful preparation rather than reactive confrontation, values that served me well across 4 decades of engineering work, and that ultimately served me just as well in the most painful personal crisis of my later years. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe people reveal their true character in the moments they think you have nothing left to give, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.